Like any huge monster game, the most tedious aspect of setup and teardown is sorting the counters. And what you see here are all of the Commonwealth units with an availability date of 1939 or earlier. As I mentioned previously, what I like to do when I'm storing the game is I will place all of the units for each of the major powers into one single kind of largish bag here. And the reason I choose 1939 and earlier is that most of the games that I will play of WIF will be the 1939 Global War scenario or the 1936 Days of Decision scenario, and I tend to play the 39 scenario a lot more. So with that, I can just grab this bag, and I know I've got everything I'm going to need for the major power in question, and then I can sort that into the force pools. Now, if I'm playing a scenario that starts in, say, 1942, I'll grab the at start bag, the 39 bag here, and then I'll just grab the 40, 41, and 42 yearly edition bags, and I'll sort those and add them to the force pools at the beginning. Now, this is a very rough sort. What I tend to do is, rather than put everything into each specific force pool as I'm sort of wading through this giant pile of counters, I will break it down. Usually I'll put all the aircraft you can see here. These are the carrier planes, and by the way, all of what you see here includes all of the deluxe units in the game. So if you're just playing classic, you're not going to have any of these counters here. The naval ships pile here you see is going to be much smaller. You won't have any of, let's see, your aircraft pile is going to be smaller here. You won't have any of these artillery units or any of the division units here. So one advantage Classic has over Deluxe is a little quicker setup time, and that's because you're dealing with a lot fewer units. Now, how do we determine which units go into which force pool? When you set about sorting your counters, you want to sort them by the backs of the counters, because every unit they've got their specific information on the front of the counter, which may include nationality. For instance, here's an Indian Motorized Corps, if I can get that to focus, with all its combat and movement factors. On the back, though, you're going to see that it looks identical to this British Motorized Corps. And so when it comes to sorting units into force pools, you're looking to put everything that has an identical back into the same force pool. Now, the only difference is going to be the yearly availability date, but it's got the same symbol, and just as importantly, it has the same cost and build time. That's how you know that a unit belongs in the same force pool. So we can take, let's see if I can get a little closer shot of these. Looking at all of the motorized corps in the Commonwealth force pool, you'll see on the front here that we've got a Canadian, an infantry, 3 British corps. Flip them all over, and they're all the same except for the yearly availability date. So these are all going to go into the same cup that I use. Now you notice the motorized corps here on the left has a white filled in symbol as opposed to the khaki filled in symbol. All that indicates is that the unit is a white print unit. So this is not going to go into a separate force pool. It's going to go into the same force pool as all the others. And the reason why these are all kind of generic on the back is that when you build a unit in WIF from your force pools, you're going to randomly draw that unit out with a couple of very few exceptions. And I'll talk about those when we get to the production episode in the tutorial. So you can see, if I pull back a little bit here, we look at the infantry that's available. We've got Indian, South Africans, British. Again, all of these have the same symbol on the back and the same cost. They cost 3 build points and they take 2 turns to arrive. So as I'm sorting these, all of these are going to go into the same cup. Now, there are a couple of things that you do need to watch out for when you're sorting. And those are any units like this infantry corps here that has RES across the top. This stands for reserve. This is part of the major powers reserves. And if a major power starts the game neutral, like all of the major powers except Japan and China do in 1939, instead of placing these reserve units in your force pools, you're going to place these reserve units in the reserve pool, which is located on the turn record chart where the production circle is. And I'll show you that here shortly. Now, in the 1940 victory in the West scenario that we're setting up, we're only going to use Germany, France, and the Commonwealth, and all three of those major powers are already at war, which means we don't have to worry about separating out these reserves into a separate force pool. But if the major power is neutral at the start of the game, and the scenario setup information will tell you that, you'll want to separate these reserves out and put the reserves into a pile. And that you can put all of the reserves, doesn't matter what type of unit it is. Here we have a militia that's a part of the reserves. These units, you would just stack them up and then you'll place them over in the reserve pool. Otherwise, it's a matter of matching things up. Now, one thing that we do here, with our house rule, you'll see we're getting into some deluxe stuff here rather than just a plain vanilla width, but the units with a light blue symbol, this is the artillery symbol, it's a motorized artillery symbol. Anything that's light blue is considered artillery. There are three different types of artillery in World in Flames. You have your just your kind of your regular artillery here. You have anti-aircraft artillery, and you have anti-tank artillery. We tend to just throw all of the artillery into the same force pool cup. However, you'll notice that a lot of them have different costs on the back. There we go. So while these two motorized regular artillery cost 5, as well as the anti-aircraft, this anti-tank artillery only costs 4. In this case, if you're spending 4 build points to build an artillery unit, you would select from among all the artillery units that cost 4. Let me show you what I mean by the cups. Now we see here, and I think I may have shown you this in another tutorial episode, but I like to use these small Dixie cups as the individual force pools, primarily because they're stackable. It takes up really small footprint on the playing area. They're easily organized, and I can randomize my draws very easily with them. I'll show you what I mean here. So we're going to take, for instance, all of our infantry units go into the infantry force pool cup in this case. And you can see there they are in the cup. When I'm building one and I need to select one from the force pool, I'll just cover it up, give it a little shake. They're already in my opaque container, and I'll pull it out, and this unit will be placed on the production track. And then I can take all of my motorized core and simply drop them into the next cup. I can stack those up, and so on as we go through, and eventually you'll have a bit of a tower of cups there. The Commonwealth is probably the single biggest stack of cups you will use. China tends to be pretty short, and again, a reason for that is the naval units are not all simply thrown into the same force pool. You're going to break them down not only by aircraft carrier, as we have one here, but again, you're going to look at the backs of the counters. And in the case of your naval units, you can see the aircraft carrier here has the white carrier symbol. There's a black symbol here for your larger, these are essentially your battleships. And their cost, remember, they have a 2-cycle build process in World in Flames, and there are you have to pay build points at the beginning of each of those 2 cycles. The way to sort your naval ships is by the cost of the first cycle, as well as by the symbol. So I'm going to have a carrier. Actually, I'm going to have, for the Commonwealth, I'm going to have 2 carrier force pools. They're going to take up 2 separate cups because I have, we can see it here, I have kind of a light, almost like an escort carrier that only costs 1 build point on its first build cycle, as opposed to the 2 cost for the first cycle on a fleet carrier. And this particular instance, this would be HMS Courageous versus HMS Unicorn. So these are going to end up in two separate cups. Likewise, I have a battleship here, or battle cruiser, the Repulse. That is going to end up in a separate cup from these smaller cruisers here. You can see they only have a 1 cost for their first build cycle as opposed to the 2. Now you ignore the cost of the second cycle here. So we've got one cruiser that cost 1 build point on the first cycle and 0 on the second. This is one of the small light cruisers, HMS Scylla. And we have a cruiser here that costs 1 on the first cycle, but it costs 2 on the second cycle. This would be HMS Kent. These are both cruisers. They're both going to go into the same force pool. So when you go to build one of these, you'll be drawing potentially from either one of those. Now, once they go into the construction pool, they'll be face up, and you will be able to choose which of these two you want to build. If you don't have the extra 2 build points and you need some more surface ships out there, then you'll obviously choose the Scylla here at the 0 cost. So the Commonwealth player is going to be sorting a lot of naval units, and I actually recommend not sorting the naval units into force pools until after you have set up all of the naval units, because the naval units are set up by name. So you will be looking not just for generic battleship, you're going to be looking for HMS Repulse or HMS Courageous. So I usually will go through and leave the naval units kind of in a semi-organized pile as face up as possible, and I'll be searching through and pulling them out by name for setup. Then the remaining naval units, which actually is not very many, since the Commonwealth starts 1939 scenario at least with almost all of the units you see here. There'll be just a handful of units remaining in the cups, so the sorting job isn't that tough at the end. Over to the right, you see the convoy points. And these contain both regular convoy points and the black tanker convoy points. These are almost equivalent to markers in the game. So I will usually just take this giant pile and I will put them all together in the same cup. Now with aircraft, again, you're going to sort these based on the symbol and cost on the back of the counter. So if we take a closer look here, we have a fighter on the right, and we have a land bomber on the left. Now this aircraft, if I'm looking at these from the front, in this case it's a Hurricane 1 and a Whirlwind, they're both fighters. However, when I turn over to the back, you'll see they both have the fighter symbol. However, the Hurricane has a cost of 4 versus a cost of 5 for the Whirlwind. That's because this is a twin engine fighter as opposed to a single engine fighter. Also, the single engine fighter only takes 2 turns to build, while the twin engine fighter requires 3 turns, which means, you guessed it, these 2 units are going to go into separate cups in the force pool. So you will build, when you're building, you will get to decide whether you want to build a single engine fighter or a twin engine fighter and pay the respective cost, but you'll be drawing from units in that specific cup. So there's quite a bit of sorting to go on here. And one other thing, if you are using the divisions, here for instance is an infantry division. The infantry divisions look very similar to the infantry corps, which are the primary units here. And we'll get, there you go, get these up where you can see them. The major difference is the unit size symbol. You've got the double X symbol for division versus the triple X symbol for corps. When you're sorting them, however, you can see on the back, they both have the infantry box symbol. However, the infantry division only has a cost and build time of 2 versus a cost of 3 build points for the infantry corps, which means the infantry divisions will be in a separate force pool from your infantry corps. That's kind of the breakdown on sorting counters. Again, it's not a pleasant job. It's something you just kind of have to wade through. It does contribute to the rather long setup time for the game. However, The setup time relative to the amount of time it actually takes to play through 1939 global war scenario, for instance, it's worth it. It's several man hours. I would say you're looking at probably 6 to 7 man hours to do the setup. Now, if you got 5 guys playing the game, that's going to take you a couple hours total time to get the game set up. Obviously, if there's only 2 of you, you're looking at more like 3.5, maybe 4 hours to kind of go through, because now everybody's got that much more work to do as far as sorting counters go. Now, the rules also specify that you are to remove some units when you get ready to start sorting the counters, and you've already got enough counters to sort as it is, so I recommend removing these beforehand, if at all possible, to save you some unnecessary work. First thing they tell you to remove are all of the Austrian, Czechoslovakian, and Ethiopian units from the game. These are minor countries that start any of the World in Flames scenarios already conquered, and therefore these units are out of the game. I've taken care of that by placing those 3 minor country units into a single small baggie. I just simply toss it back in the box and I'm done. The only exception is if you're playing the 1936 Days of Decision scenario. In that case, you will need those potentially in the course of that game. Also, any neutral minor countries, you can worry about. You just leave those in the baggies or in your counter tray. Don't mess with those until such time as somebody actually declares war on them, or they otherwise join the war, and then you can sort them at that time. So that will save you some time as well. So don't worry about the neutrals. There are some counters from major power units that have city names on the back of them. These are city-based volunteers, and they only become available when the major power controls that particular city. The Axis probably have more of these than the Allies do, but here's an example in the Commonwealth Force Pool. You can see this Garrison Corps has Athens on the back. I'm not going to place this unit into the Garrison Force Pool for the Commonwealth until the Commonwealth controls Athens. So I will take these, and a lot of times I will just form a small pile of these. Again, the Allies don't have too many of these, but I will form a small pile and place that in the reserve pool, and then just pull them out of the reserve pool at the appropriate time. And the last set of units that you're directed to remove are any units with a year availability date later than the current scenario start. So again, you can see we've got 1939 here if you're playing the global war scenario, or in this case, since we're setting up Victory in the West, which begins in 1940, I will remove all units that have a 1941 or later date. And with my storage system, that's already taken care of for me, because when I'm putting the game away, I go ahead and I place all of the 1940, 41, 42 units in their own separate baggies and pull them out when it comes time to make the annual additions to the force pools. So that's kind of taken care of for me right before I do, without doing any work during the actual setup. Now, after you've removed those units, you may remove any naval unit with a sunk date that is earlier than the scenario start. And the sunk dates are those dates in red on the back of the naval counters. Here's an example. Who is this? This is HMAS Perth. And Perth was sunk on the 1st of March, 1942, which means if we were playing a 1943 or 1944 scenario start, Perth is a ship that I could, at my option, remove from the force pool. Now, if you do that, it means it will be unavailable. It's basically you're removing it from the game. It will be unavailable to be built during the game at all. Now, why would you want to remove units from your force pool? A lot of the units involved are earlier units that are quickly obsolete as better units enter your force pool. So rather than watering down your force pool late in the game, as these units get destroyed, you can simply scrap them from the game. Speaking of scrapping, in addition to naval units that were sunk before the start of the current scenario, you may also remove any unit with an availability date that is 3 years earlier than the start date for active major powers, or 4 years earlier if the country is neutral. So again, as an example, we're setting up victory in the West that starts in 1940, which means Germany, France, and the Commonwealth, since they are all active major powers, they can remove any unit from their force pool with a date of 1937 or earlier. So again, you can remove naval units that were sunk before the scenario start, or any unit that has an availability date 3 years prior to the scenario start for active major powers, or 4 years prior to the start if they are neutral major powers. So I'm going to, that's quite a bit on sorting the counters into force pools, but I know some people had some questions on that, and it can be a little confusing. So I've spent a lot of time on that. Hopefully that clears things up, as well as maybe throwing in a couple of tips that we like to use here locally. Now, I think I've avoided getting back to sorting the rest of these counters as long as I could. So I'm going to dive into that and not subject you guys to making you watch me do that. Once I finish getting everything into the cups and we're ready to move on to the next step in the setup, we'll pick back up then.